Hello and welcome back to Tutoring with Gavin. In this series of video tutorials, I'll be analysing the characters in the play An Inspector Calls by J B Priestley. In this video tutorial, I will analyse the character of Mrs Birling, who is such an evocative and provocative character in the play. She is the least affected by Inspector Gould's investigation, and yet she stirs many in the audience with anger and disgust. She represents the upper-class Victorian capitalist and a certain type of woman who helps prop up a patriarchal society. Her function in the play is to challenge socialist ideology and to contrast Priestley's ideals of social justice. The first hint from Priestley about this formidable woman is in the stage directions at the start of Act 1. Birling's wife is about 50, a rather cold woman, and her husband's social superior. She changes very little from start to finish, which shows self-confidence that perhaps comes from her upper-class background, where money, influence and privilege and education is certain to give people confidence in their sense of entitlement. Moral responsibility depends on the moral lenses that you wear in life, and if you are in power, one of those responsibilities you are taught is to maintain that power for the next generation. Eva is contrasted to Mrs Birling in this respect, as she has a very different sense of what moral responsibility means. She is sacked by Birling for fighting for the rights of workers, and is uneasy at the idea of taking money that has been stolen. Mrs Birling is probably the least empathetic and the most judgmental character in this play. She represents the Victorian upper-class woman, restrained and pious, with fixed ideas about how society should function, with everyone knowing their place. She tells Sheila in the opening scene that when you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I did. This Victorian idea of men doing important things and women supporting them may seem strange now, but it is symbolic of the way women were considered less intelligent or resilient than men. At this time, upper-class women usually left the room after dinner to allow the men to talk. Mrs Birling takes Sheila into the drawing room for this very reason. She later tries to shield Sheila from the details of Gerald's affair with Eva, as if she were too delicate to cope with the truth. It would be much better if Sheila didn't listen to this story at all. During this period of history, the suffragette movement was making a courageous stand against the patriarchal society, often making great sacrifices, and yet Mrs Birling perpetuates the role of women as that of a second-class citizen of lower value, intellect and mental strength. However, by leaving the men alone to demonstrate some misogynistic views, it does allow Priestley to remove Mrs Birling from the stage and therefore is not present when Inspector Gould arrives. If she had been present, perhaps Gould might have found it more difficult to control the situation, as Mrs Birling is not one to be ordered around, especially by lower class policemen. When she does finally return to the stage, briskly and self-confidently, Gould has already disrupted the unity of the house and taken several characters to task over their responsibility in the death of Eva Smith. Her arrogance, shown through Priestley's stage directions that include words like haughtily, rather grandly, with sudden anger, agitated, seems in direct contrast with the other characters who have been made to feel varying degrees of shame over the death. Her attitude towards the working class is gradually revealed. She thinks that Gould's attitude is a trifle impertinent, and when talking about Eva's suicide, she says, "Girls of that class," but is interrupted by Sheila, who knows her mother's prejudices all too well. She later justifies her denial of charity to Eva by saying, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. Mrs Birling also sees young people as inferior and is often condescending towards her own children. She tells Gould, "You seem to have made a great impression on this child." She repeatedly refers to her adult children as a girl and a boy, as if her age gives her the right to authority and wisdom. As the older generation, Birling and his wife represent selfishness in society, and their ideals are ingrained in their children. In contrast with Sheila and Eric, who have also contributed to the cause of Eva's death, their parents refuse to accept their role in events, and unlike the children, show they have learned nothing from their mistakes. Sheila and Mrs Birling represent the contrast between 20th century and Victorian attitudes. Priestley is showing his 1945 audience how things can change further. Women had shown during the two wars that they were equal in the workplace. Mrs Birling repeatedly refers to Eva and Sheila as girls and seems to provide support for the patriarchal system that sees women as weaker. She tells Sheila that she is behaving like a hysterical child, which uses two Victorian stereotypes of women as hysterical and childlike, which was used by men as an excuse to refuse them the vote. When Mrs Birling says, "We've done a great deal of useful work in helping deserving cases," this depends on what is meant by deserving. Clearly, Eva did not qualify as deserving. But when we examine the real reason she was denied charity, it seems to be because of her pride and dignity in refusing to take stolen money and not expecting Eric to marry her. Mrs Birling seems to expect the women who came from Brumley Women's Charity Organisation to grovel and beg, which makes her feel more powerful. She'd impertinently made use of our name and was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples were simply absurd in a girl of her position. Ironically, her insistence on making the father of Eva's baby take responsibility reveals her hypocrisy, as she would never allow Eric to marry Eva because they are from a different class. She shows little remorse at the end of the play when she thinks they can get away with hiding this scandal, and yet she is responsible for the death of her own grandchild. But her joy at the revelation that Gould is an imposter suggests she feels nothing for the child, probably because of its low breeding. It is equally ironic that her own children were born from a marriage of two classes, but she perhaps drew the line with integrating her family bloodline with the working classes. Ultimately, Mrs Birling stands firm in the idea that she did nothing wrong and blames Eva for her fate. I think she had only herself to blame. Priestley is trying to demonstrate through Mrs Birling and her husband this lack of empathy for those less fortunate, showing how capitalist ideology was cruel and unjust. Well, I hope this has been useful in your revision. Please give us the thumbs up if you like the video, and please subscribe to the channel so that I can continue to make these video tutorials. Until next time.